How one border decision rewrote a nation's future. One line on a map changed millions of lives, even though almost nobody living there was asked. What looked like a technical adjustment became a permanent fracture, and its consequences are still unfolding today. Borders feel permanent when we look at them now. Solid lines printed in atlases and enforced by laws, armies, and flags, but many of them were born from rushed decisions made in distant rooms by people who would never live with the outcome. This story matters today because the modern world is still shaped by borders drawn under pressure, fear, and ambition, and the same logic that created them continues to influence conflicts, migrations, and national identities. In this case, the decision came a moment of exhaustion, when war had drained empires of money, people, and patience, and stability mattered more than fairness or precision. Leaders wanted clean solutions, fast resolutions, and borders that looked orderly on paper, even if reality on the ground was far more complex. The map was simpler than the territory, and the map prevailed. The people drawing these lines were not on the ground. They worked from reports, from maps that showed terrain but not relationships, from data that counted populations but not connections. Their knowledge was abstract, systematic, and incomplete. The region itself was anything but simple. Different languages overlapped. Cultures blended across towns, and economic life ignored political boundaries entirely, functioning as a shared system long before anyone tried to divide it. For generations, people moved, traded, married, and worked without thinking in terms of separate nations. But when power shifted and negotiations began, complexity became an inconvenience. Decision-makers reduced living communities into statistics, categories, and strategic assets, believing that a single border could impose order where history had created overlap. At first, the border seemed harmless. Maps were updated, administrations reorganized, and officials promised that daily life would continue with minimal disruption. On paper, the change was neat, logical, and final. What no one fully acknowledged was that borders do more than separate land. They redefine belonging, loyalty, and identity, forcing people to choose sides even when their lives were built across both. This was the quiet beginning of a transformation that would not explode immediately, but would slowly reshape the nation's politics, economy, and sense of self in ways no one had planned. Once established, borders generate their own constituencies. Bureaucracies form around them. Economic interests align with them. Political identities crystallize along them. What begins as an arbitrary line becomes embedded in countless systems, each of which resists change. And once a border is drawn, history rarely allows it to be erased without a cost. At first, the effects of the new border felt administrative rather than personal, as documents replaced habits and checkpoints appeared where roads once flowed freely, creating inconvenience but not yet resentment. The human cost became visible slowly. Families discovered they now lived in different countries despite never moving, while workers crossed newly defined lines each morning, carrying permits instead of familiarity, slowly realizing that identity was being rewritten without their consent. Governments insisted the border was temporary in spirit, a technical solution meant to stabilize governance and prevent further conflict. But enforcement grew tighter as security concerns replaced cooperation. Economic systems that once functioned as a single organism began to fracture as supply chains broke, markets shrank, and regions that depended on shared infrastructure found themselves isolated by policy rather than geography. The border also created political imbalance, empowering some regions while marginalizing others, planting early seeds of grievance that leaders dismissed as adjustment pains rather than structural flaws. The border also reshaped memory itself. Histories were rewritten to justify the division. Stories that once emphasized connection were replaced by narratives of difference. The shared past became contested territory, claimed by both sides in ways that made reconciliation harder with each passing year. As years passed, temporary measures hardened into permanent reality, and a generation grew up knowing only separation, learning national narratives that framed neighbors as foreigners instead of partners. Attempts to soften the divide through treaties and local agreements faced resistance from central authorities who feared that flexibility signaled weakness or loss of control. Cultural expressions that once blended traditions now became symbols of loyalty, scrutinized for hints of allegiance to the other side, turning language, education, and memory into political tools. What had been sold as a clean solution was slowly revealing itself as a living fault line, one that shifted pressure into daily life rather than resolving it. The border was no longer just a line on a map, but a force shaping opportunity, identity, and resentment, quietly preparing the ground for deeper conflict. And the longer it remained unquestioned, the harder it became to imagine any alternative. What had been manageable as inconvenience became unbearable as injustice. The accumulation of small grievances reached a critical mass. The conflict deepened as political leaders began to exploit the border rather than resolve it, framing division as protection and separation as proof of sovereignty, while ignoring the damage accumulating beneath the surface. National identity hardened on both sides, fueled by selective history and simplified narratives that transformed a shared past into opposing stories of loss and entitlement. Economic disparity widened, not because one side was inherently weaker, but because the border redirected investment, attention, and resources along political lines that favor stability over integration. Security measures multiplied, checkpoints expanded, and surveillance increased, reinforcing the idea that danger lived on the other side, even when daily reality contradicted the fear. Communities once connected by work and tradition now interacted through bureaucracy, their relationships filtered by visas, regulations, and suspicion imposed from above. Internally, dissent grew as citizens questioned why a decision made decades earlier still controlled their present, but challenging the border became synonymous with challenging national unity. International actors treated the situation as frozen, stable enough to ignore, despite clear signs that unresolved tension was accumulating rather than disappearing. Each crisis, economic downturn, or political shock intensified resentment, because the border limited collective solutions and forced each side to absorb pressure alone. The buildup reached its peak when it became clear that the border had not solved conflict, but delayed it, storing unresolved grievances in everyday life. What had once been justified as pragmatic governance was now exposing its long-term cost, as division became normalized and reconciliation felt increasingly distant. The nation stood at a crossroads, shaped by a line drawn in haste, struggling to decide whether stability was worth the price of permanent fracture. The climax came not through sudden violence, but through a breaking point where accumulated frustration finally outweighed fear, revealing how deeply the border had reshaped lives, opportunities, and loyalties over time. Protests, political upheaval, and social movements exposed what had long been ignored, that the line meant to create order had instead preserved inequality, resentment, and mistrust across generations. The realization was unavoidable, because borders are not neutral structures. They are choices that continue to act long after the ink dries, shaping who belongs, who benefits, and who is left unheard. In reflecting on this story, the lesson is not that borders are inherently wrong, but that decisions made without those affected carry consequences far beyond their original intent. What once appeared as a solution for exhausted leaders became a long-term challenge for ordinary people, forced to navigate identities imposed rather than chosen. Today, as new borders are debated and old ones questioned, this story serves as a reminder that stability achieved without inclusion rarely remains stable. The future of any nation depends not only on where lines are drawn, but on whether they can adapt when those lines begin to fracture society itself. Sometimes the most powerful force in history is not conflict, but the decision to pause, listen, and reconsider what was once assumed permanent. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.